There's a moment that comes to every man who refuses to kneel. It arrives without warning, usually in silence, often alone. You're standing in a room full of people who expect you to explain yourself, to justify your choices, to defend your existence, and something inside you simply stops, not breaks, stops, like a machine that's been running on someone else's fuel, finally recognizing it was built for something else entirely. In that moment, you realize the most dangerous thing you can do in a world that demands your submission is to remain utterly, devastatingly calm. Because power doesn't argue, power doesn't justify, power simply is. And the moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you become unexplainable, unreachable, ungovernable. This is where most men lose themselves. Not in the grand betrayals or the obvious defeats, but in the thousand small moments where they trade sovereignty for approval, where they dilute their truth to make others comfortable, where they perform goodness instead of embodying strength. They think they're being mature, evolved, enlightened. But what they're actually doing is erasing themselves one compromise at a time until they wake up one day and realize they've become a stranger in their own life, a ghost haunting a body that used to belong to someone with fire in his chest and steel in his spine. Machiavelli understood something that modern men have forgotten. He wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But here's what gets lost in translation. Fear, in this context, doesn't mean terror. It means weight, gravity, the kind of presence that makes people recalibrate their behavior simply because you've entered the room. Not because you're aggressive, but because you're immovable. Not because you threaten, but because you don't need to. Your boundaries are so clear, so non-negotiable, that people instinctively understand where the line is without you ever having to draw it. This is the first principle of sovereignty. You don't defend your territory, you embody it. The moment you start explaining why you deserve respect is the moment you've already lost it. Because respect isn't a debate, it's a recognition. And what people recognize isn't your arguments or your credentials or your good intentions. They recognize your relationship with yourself. They sense whether you believe in your own authority or whether you're constantly seeking permission to exist. Let me show you exactly what this looks like. You're in a meeting. Someone interrupts you mid-sentence, not aggressively, just casually dismissive, the way people do when they don't register you as significant. Most men do one of two things. They either get louder, trying to reclaim the floor through volume, or they shrink, accepting the interruption as confirmation of their irrelevance. Both responses are forms of surrender. The sovereign response is different. You stop talking completely. You don't finish your sentence. You don't raise your voice. You simply stop and look at the person who interrupted you, not with anger, not with hurt, with curiosity, as if you're observing a fascinating specimen of social dysfunction. The silence that follows will be excruciating for everyone except you, because you're comfortable in it. You live there, and after 3, maybe 4 seconds, which will feel like an eternity to them, you calmly say, "I'll wait." 2 words, no explanation, no accusation, just a statement of fact. You'll wait. And then you do. You sit back slightly, you maintain eye contact, and you wait. What happens next is instructive. The person who interrupted you will either apologize, which restores order, or they'll try to continue, which exposes them as socially incompetent in front of everyone watching. Either way, you win. Not because you fought, but because you refused to participate in a dynamic that didn't serve you. This is tactical sovereignty. But it only works if it's rooted in something deeper, because techniques without foundation are just performance, and performance always collapses under pressure. The real work happens in the architecture of your inner world, in how you relate to your own value, in whether you need external validation to feel real, or whether you've built something so solid inside yourself that other people's opinions become interesting data points rather than existential threats. Here's the paradox. that breaks most men. The more you need to be seen as powerful, the less power you actually have. Because need is the opposite of power. Need is dependency. Need is a leash. And the moment someone realizes you need their approval, their affection, their validation, they own you. Not maliciously necessarily, just structurally, because you've handed them the remote control to your emotional state. You've made them the arbiter of your worth, and once that happens, you're not a sovereign individual anymore. You're a satellite orbiting someone else's sun, hoping they'll shine on you. Machiavelli warned about this too. He said that a prince who depends on the goodwill of others to maintain his position will inevitably fall. Because goodwill is fickle. Goodwill is conditional. Goodwill evaporates the moment it's inconvenient. But a prince who rules from his own strength, who maintains power through clarity and competence rather than popularity, that prince endures. Not because he's loved, but because he's essential. Not because he's liked, but because he's undeniable. Translate this to your life. Every relationship you have, romantic, professional, familial, social, operates on a power dynamic whether you acknowledge it or not. And that dynamic is determined by a simple question. Who needs whom more? The person who needs less has the power, not to abuse, not to manipulate, but to set terms, to establish boundaries, to walk away if those boundaries aren't respected. This isn't cruelty, this is clarity. And clarity is the most loving thing you can offer because it eliminates confusion. It tells people exactly where they stand and what's required to remain there. But most men are terrified of this. They've been taught that having standards is arrogant, that maintaining boundaries is selfish, that walking away is abandonment. So they stay in situations that diminish them. They tolerate disrespect because they're afraid of being alone. They accept crumbs because they don't believe they deserve the whole meal. And every time they do this, they reinforce the belief that they're not worth more. Not just in other people's eyes, but in their own. Because your tolerance for mistreatment is a direct reflection of how you value yourself. Let me give you another example, more intimate this time. You're in a relationship. She says something cutting, disguised as a joke. "You're so sensitive," she laughs, after saying something designed to hurt. Most men either laugh along, pretending it didn't land, or they get defensive, trying to explain why it wasn't funny. Both responses confirm her frame, that you're too sensitive, that you can't take a joke, that you're weak. The sovereign response is different. You don't laugh, you don't defend. You look at her directly and say calmly, "That wasn't a joke, that was an insult." And I don't accept insults, even when they're dressed up as humor. Then you stop talking. You don't elaborate. You don't soften it with, "I know you didn't mean it," or "I'm sure you were just kidding." You state the boundary and you let it sit there, heavy and undeniable. What happens next tells you everything you need to know about the relationship. If she apologizes, genuinely, you've just deepened the respect between you. If she doubles down, gets defensive, accuses you of overreacting, you've just learned that she doesn't respect your boundaries. And that information is gold, because now you can make an informed decision about whether this is someone who deserves continued access to you. This is where most men fail. They get the information, they see the disrespect clearly, and then they ignore it. They make excuses, they rationalize, they tell themselves it'll get better, but it won't. Because you've just taught her that your boundaries are negotiable, that if she pushes hard enough, you'll fold, and once that lesson is learned, the relationship is over. Not officially, maybe. You might stay together for years, but the respect is gone. And without respect, there's no attraction. Without attraction, there's no passion. Without passion, you're just two people sharing space, slowly resenting each other, wondering why it doesn't feel like it used to. The brutal truth is this: people will treat you exactly as badly as you allow them to, not because they're evil, but because humans are efficiency machines. We naturally seek the path of least resistance. If you don't enforce your boundaries, people will naturally expand into your space. Not maliciously, just naturally, like water filling a container. And if you have no container, no structure, no edges, you'll just be absorbed into their agenda, their priorities, their reality. You'll become a supporting character in someone else's story instead of the protagonist of your own. This is the second principle of sovereignty. Your life is not a democracy. You don't take votes on your boundaries. You don't seek consensus on your standards. You don't apologize for your requirements. You simply state them clearly and calmly, and then you enforce them without emotion, not as punishment, but as natural consequence. If someone can't meet your standard, they don't get access to you. It's that simple. And that simplicity is what makes it so powerful, because there's no negotiation, no drama, no long explanations, just clarity. And clarity is magnetic because it's so rare. But here's where it gets dangerous. Here's where most men who start to understand this make a critical mistake. They confuse sovereignty with isolation. They think that not needing people means pushing everyone away. They become cold, distant, performatively indifferent. And they wonder why they're alone, why nobody wants to be around them, why their newfound power feels hollow. It's because they've misunderstood the assignment. Sovereignty isn't about not needing people. It's about not needing any specific person. It's about building a life so full, so rich, so aligned with your values that any individual relationship becomes an enhancement rather than a necessity. You want people in your life. You enjoy connection, you value intimacy, but you don't require it to feel whole. And that's the difference. That's what makes you magnetic instead of desperate, selective instead of needy, powerful instead of posturing. Machiavelli wrote that the wise prince keeps his own counsel, but listens to many advisors. He doesn't isolate himself, but he never becomes dependent on any single voice. He maintains relationships strategically, understanding that alliances are valuable, but allegiance to any one person is dangerous. Applied to modern life, this means you cultivate a network of relationships, each serving different needs, each valued for different reasons, but none of them holding your emotional survival hostage. You have friends who challenge you intellectually, friends who make you laugh, friends who share your mission, a partner who complements your vision. But if any of them disappeared tomorrow, you'd grieve, certainly, but you wouldn't collapse, because your foundation is internal, not external. This is what women mean when they say they want a man who's whole. They don't mean perfect, they mean complete, self-contained, a man who has his own gravity instead of orbiting hers. Because here's what nobody tells you about attraction. It's not generated by need, it's generated by choice. When a woman feels like you need her, like you'd fall apart without her, like she's the sun around which your world revolves, it might feel flattering initially, but it quickly becomes suffocating, because she doesn't want to be your mother. She doesn't want to be responsible for your emotional stability. She wants to be chosen by a man who could survive without her, but prefers not to. That's the difference between dependency and devotion. Dependency says, I need you to be okay. Devotion says, I'm okay either way, but I choose you. And choice is infinitely more powerful than need. Let me show you exactly how this plays out. You've been seeing someone for a few months. Things are good. Then she starts to pull back. Texts get shorter. Plans get vaguer. Most men panic. They increase their effort. They text more. They try to schedule more dates. They ask, is everything okay? They seek reassurance, and with every attempt to close the distance, they push her further away. Because what she's doing, consciously or not, is testing. She's pulling back to see if you'll chase, to see if you need her, to see if your stability depends on her proximity. The sovereign response is counterintuitive. You match her energy. She pulls back, you give her space, not as punishment, not as a game, but as respect for her autonomy and confidence in your own value. You don't text more, you text less. You don't seek reassurance, you continue building your life. You don't ask what's wrong. You assume she's handling whatever she needs to handle. And here's what happens. One of two things. Either she comes back, usually with more interest than before, because you've just demonstrated that you don't need her, which paradoxically makes you more attractive. Or she doesn't come back, in which case you've just saved yourself months or years with someone who wasn't genuinely interested. Either way, you win, because you maintained your sovereignty. This is the third principle. Your response to withdrawal should never be pursuit. It should be continuation. You continue your mission. You continue your growth. You continue your life. Because your life doesn't pause when someone exits. It doesn't accelerate when someone enters. It maintains its own rhythm, its own direction, its own gravity. And people who are meant to be in your orbit will be pulled in by that gravity. People who aren't will drift away. And both outcomes are perfect because both outcomes preserve your sovereignty. But let's go deeper. Let's talk about the psychology underneath all of this, because tactics without understanding are just tricks, and tricks eventually fail. The real question is, why do most men struggle with this? Why is sovereignty so difficult to maintain? The answer is conditioning. From childhood, most men are taught that their value is determined by external metrics, by achievement, by approval, by being useful to others. They're taught to be good boys, which means compliant boys, quiet boys, boys who don't make waves, boys who earn love through performance. And that conditioning runs deep, so deep, that by the time they're adults, they don't even realize they're performing anymore. They think that's just who they are, a man who accommodates, who compromises, who puts others first. And they wonder why they feel empty, why they feel resentful, why they feel like they're living someone else's life. The path to sovereignty requires unlearning this. It requires recognizing that your value isn't something you earn, it's something you claim, not arrogantly, not at others' expense, but firmly, definitively. You decide what you're worth, and then you refuse to accept less. Not through aggression, but through standards. You don't argue about your value. You don't justify it. You simply embody it. And people who can't see it don't get access to you. It's that simple, and that simplicity is what makes it so difficult, because it requires you to be willing to lose people, to be willing to be alone, to be willing to be misunderstood. And most men aren't willing to pay that price. They'd rather be accepted than be authentic. They'd rather be liked than be respected. They'd rather be comfortable than be sovereign. But here's what they don't understand. Comfort is the enemy of power. Every time you choose comfort over truth, you weaken yourself. Every time you stay silent when you should speak, you diminish yourself. Every time you tolerate disrespect to avoid conflict, you teach the world that you're not worth respecting. And the world is a very good student. It will learn that lesson quickly and thoroughly. And once it's learned, it's very difficult to unteach. Let me give you a professional example. You're in a team meeting. Your boss takes credit for your idea, just casually mentions it as if it was his thought. Most men do nothing. They tell themselves it's not worth making a scene, that they'll get credit eventually. That being a team player is more important than being recognized, but what they're actually doing is training their boss to steal from them. Because if there's no consequence, why wouldn't he do it again? The sovereign response happens immediately but calmly. You don't wait until after the meeting. You don't send a passive-aggressive email later. Right there, in the moment, you say, "I appreciate you bringing that up. Just to clarify for everyone, that was the strategy I proposed last week in our one-on-one. I'm glad you see the value in it." You say it without accusation, without anger, just as a factual correction. What happens next is instructive. Your boss will either acknowledge it, which restores your credit, or he'll try to minimize it, which exposes him as dishonest in front of the team. Either way, you've just established that you won't be stolen from silently. You've drawn a line, and that line will be respected going forward, not because you were aggressive, but because you were clear. This is tactical sovereignty in professional contexts. But it requires something most men don't have, the willingness to risk the relationship for the sake of respect. Because when you correct your boss publicly, even politely, you're taking a risk. He might retaliate, he might make your life difficult, he might fire you, and most men aren't willing to take that risk. They'd rather be exploited than unemployed. But here's the paradox. The moment you become willing to lose the job is the moment you become unfireable. Not literally, obviously, but energetically, because you're no longer operating from fear, you're operating from standards. And people sense that. They sense when you're willing to walk away. And that willingness is what creates respect, because respect isn't given to people who need the relationship. It's given to people who could survive without it, but choose to remain as long as their standards are met. This is the fourth principle. Your willingness to walk away is directly proportional to your power in any relationship. The moment you become unwilling to leave, you become a hostage. And hostages don't negotiate from strength. They beg, they plead, they accept whatever terms are offered because they have no leverage. But the person who can walk away at any moment, that person sets the terms, not cruelly, not capriciously, but clearly. And those terms are either met or the person leaves. And both outcomes preserve sovereignty. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He wrote that a prince should never become so dependent on any ally that he cannot survive their betrayal. Because betrayal is inevitable. Not always, but often enough that you must be prepared for it. Applied to modern life, this means you never put yourself in a position where one person, one job, one relationship holds your survival hostage. You diversify, you build redundancy, you create options, not because you're paranoid, but because you're strategic, because options are freedom, and freedom is power. Let's talk about romantic relationships specifically, because this is where men lose themselves most completely. You meet someone who excites you. The chemistry is intense, the connection feels rare, and slowly, imperceptibly, you start to reorganize your life around her. You adjust your schedule to match hers. You adopt her interests. You defer to her preferences. You tell yourself you're being considerate, compromising, being a good partner, but what you're actually doing is erasing yourself. You're becoming a supporting character in her story instead of the protagonist of your own. And here's the cruel irony. The more you do this, the less attracted she becomes. Not because she's shallow or ungrateful, but because attraction requires polarity. It requires difference. It requires you to remain yourself, fully and unapologetically, so that she can remain herself. When you collapse into her world, you eliminate that polarity. You become an extension of her rather than a complement to her. And extensions aren't attractive. They're convenient, useful, but not magnetic. The sovereign man in a relationship maintains his own world. He has his own friends, his own hobbies, his own mission. He invites her into his world, but he doesn't abandon it for hers. He makes time for her, but not at the expense of his purpose. He loves her deeply, but he doesn't need her desperately, and that distinction is everything. Because when she feels that you could survive without her, that you're choosing her rather than clinging to her, it creates a completely different dynamic. She stops testing you because she already knows the answer. She stops pulling away because there's nothing to test. She leans in because she wants to be part of something solid, something real, something that doesn't collapse the moment she steps back. Here's a specific scenario. She says, "You never have time for me anymore. You're always working on your projects." Most men hear this as criticism and immediately try to fix it. They cancel their plans, they promise to make more time, they apologize, and in doing so they fail the test, because what she's really asking isn't, "Will you give me more time?" It's, "Are you still building something meaningful, or have you become complacent?" The sovereign response is, "I'm building something that matters to me, something that will create the life I want for us." I make time for you because you're important, but I won't abandon my mission to prove that. If you need more time than I can give while staying true to my purpose, then we need to talk about whether this is the right fit. That response will feel terrifying to say, because it risks the relationship. But here's what happens. She respects you more, because you've just demonstrated that you have a spine, that you're not willing to abandon yourself to keep her, and that unwillingness to abandon yourself is what makes you worth staying with. This is the fifth principle. Never abandon your mission for a relationship, because the moment you do, you become less attractive to the person you abandoned it for. It's a paradox, but it's true. Women don't want to be your mission. They want to be part of your mission. They want to support something larger than themselves. And when you make them the mission, when you make them the center of your universe, it's flattering initially, but ultimately suffocating. Because they didn't sign up to be your purpose. They signed up to share a purpose with you. Let's go even deeper now. Let's talk about the existential dimension of sovereignty, because this isn't just about tactics or relationships or professional success. This is about how you relate to your own existence. Most men live reactively. They respond to circumstances rather than creating them. They wait to be chosen rather than choosing. They adapt to the world rather than shaping it. And there's a quiet desperation in that posture, a sense that life is something that happens to them rather than something they author. And that desperation seeps into everything, into their relationships, their careers, their self-image. They become victims of circumstance, always explaining why things didn't work out, always blaming external factors, always waiting for conditions to improve before they take action. The sovereign man lives differently. He understands that circumstances are neutral, that meaning is assigned, not discovered. That power comes from authorship, from deciding what things mean and acting accordingly. When something bad happens, he doesn't ask, "Why me?" He asks, "What now?" When someone disrespects him, he doesn't seek to understand their motivation. He simply removes access. When an opportunity appears, he doesn't wait for permission. He acts. And this shift from reactive to proactive, from victim to author, from explained to unexplainable, this is the deepest form of sovereignty, because it's not about controlling external circumstances, it's about controlling your response to them. It's about maintaining your center regardless of what's happening around you. Machiavelli called this virtue. It's often translated as virtue, but that's misleading. Virtue in Machiavelli's framework means something closer to effectiveness, to capability, to the ability to impose your will on circumstances rather than being shaped by them. It's the quality that separates princes from subjects, leaders from followers, sovereign men from dependent ones, and it's cultivated through practice, through repeatedly choosing the harder path, through repeatedly enforcing your boundaries even when it's uncomfortable, through repeatedly prioritizing your mission even when it's tempting to abandon it. Here's a social example that brings this together. You're at a party. Someone makes a joke at your expense in front of a group. Everyone laughs. Most men either laugh along, pretending it doesn't bother them, or they try to make a comeback, engaging in the frame that they're the butt of the joke. Both responses confirm the frame. The sovereign response is different. You don't laugh. You don't engage. You look at the person who made the joke. You hold eye contact for a beat longer than comfortable, and then you simply turn away and continue the conversation you were having as if they don't exist. You don't acknowledge the joke. You don't validate it with a response. You simply remove them from your reality. And here's what happens. The laughter dies awkwardly, because you didn't play along. You didn't accept the frame. And now the person who made the joke looks like they're trying too hard. They look desperate for your reaction. And by not giving it to them, you've just demonstrated that they're beneath your notice. That's power, not aggressive power, not loud power, quiet, devastating power. The power of someone who doesn't need to defend themselves because they're secure in their own value. This is advanced sovereignty. This is what it looks like when you've internalized these principles so deeply that they're no longer techniques. They're just who you are. You don't think about maintaining boundaries. You just have them. You don't strategize about when to walk away. You just know. You don't perform confidence. You embody it, and people feel the difference. They sense that you're not playing a game. You're not following a script. You're simply being yourself, fully and unapologetically, and the world can either accept that or not. And you're genuinely okay with either outcome. But let's be honest about the cost. Because sovereignty isn't free. It requires sacrifice. It requires you to be willing to be alone, to be misunderstood, to be called arrogant, cold, selfish, difficult. It requires you to lose people who can't meet your standards, to walk away from opportunities that don't align with your values, to choose the harder path repeatedly even when the easier path is right there, tempting you with comfort and acceptance. And most men aren't willing to pay that price. They read about sovereignty, they understand it intellectually, they might even practice it occasionally. But when it really costs them something, when it really requires them to risk something they value, they fold. They compromise. They tell themselves it's just this once, that they'll be stronger next time. But there is no next time. There's only now. And every time you compromise your sovereignty, you make it harder to reclaim. This is why the path to power is lonely. Not because powerful people are isolated, but because the journey to power requires you to shed everyone and everything that doesn't serve your higher self. And that shedding is painful. You'll lose friends who can't handle your growth. You'll lose partners who preferred you weak. You'll lose opportunities that required you to diminish yourself. And each loss will hurt. But each loss will also clarify. Because what remains after the shedding is real, it's earned, it's aligned, and that alignment is worth more than any comfort you sacrifice to achieve it. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune is a woman who must be seized by force. This is often misunderstood as advocating aggression, but what he's really saying is that hesitation is death. That waiting for perfect conditions is a form of surrender. That power belongs to those who act decisively, even imperfectly, rather than those who wait for certainty. Applied to sovereignty, this means you don't wait until you feel ready to enforce your boundaries. You enforce them now. You don't wait until you're successful to start valuing your time. You value it now. You don't wait until you're confident to start acting with authority. You act now, and confidence follows action. This is the final principle. Sovereignty is claimed, not granted. No one will give you permission to value yourself. No one will invite you to set boundaries. No one will encourage you to prioritize your mission. You have to decide unilaterally that you matter, that your time matters, that your standards matter, and then you have to live accordingly, regardless of whether anyone agrees. And here's the beautiful, terrible truth. Most people won't agree. They'll resist. They'll test. They'll try to pull you back into the old dynamic where you were manageable, predictable, controllable, and you have to be willing to lose them. All of them, if necessary. Because sovereignty without the willingness to be alone is just performance, and performance always collapses. So here's where we end, though nothing really ends. You have a choice to make, not someday, now. You can continue living reactively, seeking approval, compromising your truth, hoping that if you're good enough, kind enough, useful enough, someone will finally choose you. Or you can choose yourself. Unilaterally, completely, irrevocably. You can decide that your value isn't up for debate, that your boundaries aren't negotiable, that your mission isn't optional, and you can live accordingly, knowing that this path will cost you everything that isn't real, everyone who doesn't truly see you, every opportunity that requires you to be less than you are, every comfort that comes at the expense of your sovereignty. And when you make that choice, when you really make it, not intellectually but existentially, something shifts. You stop seeking and start selecting. You stop explaining and start embodying. You stop performing and start being. And people notice. Not everyone, not even most people, but the right people. The people who are also sovereign. The people who recognize gravity when they encounter it. And those people don't need to be convinced of your value. They simply see it, respect it, and choose to align with it. This is what it means to command rather than beg, to attract rather than chase, to be chosen by people who are worthy of choosing you rather than being accepted by people who are doing you a favor. And once you've tasted that, once you've experienced what it feels like to live from sovereignty rather than scarcity, you can never go back, because you've remembered something you always knew but forgot, that you were never meant to kneel. You were meant to stand, fully, unapologetically, sovereign. And the world will adjust to that reality, or it won't. And either way, you'll be fine, because you're not waiting for the world's permission anymore. You're simply being who you are and letting that be enough. And it is. It always was. You just had to stop asking and start knowing.